Well, welcome to WAY2B TV, where there's a better way to be than atheist or theist. Christianity in America has always been way up in the 90-something% range related to the people who self-identify with that. Well, a national poll was taken in 1951, the year I was born, asking residents of the United States what was their religious affiliation. And 98% self-identified with some form of Christianity. But then in 2005, they took the poll again, and the second poll showed that the residents of the United States who self-identified with Christianity had dropped to 75%. So that 25% went somewhere, you know? And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about why this may have happened. So the question is, how did those who identify as Christian drop by a fourth? The internet began in 1969 on a very small scale with only a few nodes. Well, YouTube began with two PayPal employees, ex-PayPal employees, in 2005. I was taught by scholars at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Google began in 1998, just as I was finishing up seminary. And so when I went to seminary, there was no Google and there was no YouTube. Southern Baptist Seminary, though, is a good school, and though conservative, they have scholars as professors. They have individuals who are serious about what they're talking about. The subjects are very similar, and the characters involved in the Bible, the people who've lived down through history and have affected the Christian religion and the development of it, the names that we learned and the things that we learned about them were very similar to what you learn today. The information explosion granted me and everyone else access to a much broader picture of Christianity than any of us received in church. Lectures, interviews, and debates from all over the world are no longer buried in seminaries and research universities. We now have massive amounts of information, factual evidence about how Christianity developed that we did not have before. But YouTube has become a major force in education and information flowing out into the total population. The number of New Testament manuscripts and other ancient gospels, ancient epistles, letters, and apocalypses, revelations, if you will, swelled from a few hundred to thousands. And over 5,500 copies of New Testament manuscripts have been discovered with hundreds of thousands of variances between them. And church goers have gained ready access to what well-educated ministers knew but could not or would not share with their congregations without losing their jobs. All of this stuff that we know today that we have become so available to the public, seminarians learned in seminary, and I did too. And I'm just wondering, now that we're in the information boom, and so much of this information is now readily available all day, every day, to anyone who cares to avail themselves of it, what effect that's having on Christianity. So what is Scripture? The Bible, and it's what I've named this show, is the Bible, inspiration or perspiration. How was the Bible formed? Was it formed by inspiration, or was it formed by a lot of work and a lot of pulling back and forth between people? And I can tell you from pastoring 4 churches that even amongst individual congregations, from one person to another, your scripture might not be my scripture. The varying degrees to which people believe things is quite fluid throughout a congregation in the 21st century. And I experienced that while I was pastoring churches myself. But when the New Testament refers to Scripture, they're referring to the Old Testament. The New Testament didn't exist in the 1st century, not even the 2nd century, and not even in the 3rd century. the canonization of Scripture took a very, very long time. Paul's letters contain a migration in a very similar way that the Gospels contain a migration related to who is Jesus, where we have the meek and mild Jesus in the beginning, and then we have this bold Jesus who's running around saying, I am God, in the end, 65 years later. There was an individual that we were taught about in seminary, and his name comes up a lot because he was quite a character. Marcion was his name. He lived in the first half of the 2nd century. He died in about AD 160 or so. And he gave a large sum of money to the church in Rome. And he said, of course, that made him popular, because always large sums of money makes religious folks popular. So he gave that large sum of money. But after a while, he began to say some things that upset the church. The first thing he said was that the Old Testament God was not Jesus' father. That was the first thing he said. In other words, that Old Testament God was a God of slavery and of judgment and of punishment and of war and go kill everybody and all this good stuff that you hear about all the time. And Jesus' God, the God of the New Testament, was a God of love and a God of peace and a God of joy. And he felt like where Christianity was headed in the direction of adopting or possibly adopting the Hebrew Scriptures as part of the Christian canon, he was against that. He was against that because we said we don't need the Old Testament. We don't need this evil God. We need this good God that's part of the New Testament. And so that's what he proposed. Well, that made him somewhat unpopular. He also was enamored with the Apostle Paul, or with Paul, who, by the way, is the only person who ever claimed he was an apostle, was Paul himself. But at any rate, and so there were 10 of Paul's letters that Marcion knew about. It appears from the evidence that we have. Those 10 letters, and Luke was thought to be, that Gospel of Luke was thought to be someone who was a companion of Paul in his travels. Those two things were what Marcion thought should be the canon of Scripture. He thought that was all you needed. And he edited these to suit his own thoughts concerning this Old Testament God versus the God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus, as he called it. Well, Marcion then, later on, was determined to be by the church a heretic. And he was eventually thrown out of the church. And it may very well be that Marcion was the first attempt to actually canonize anything. He was the first person that we know about to make a list that someone might call what should be included in Scripture. Okay? Marcion may have started the struggle over canon. Because what then happened was, what about if you don't want Marcion's canon, you don't want Marcion's list, what's your list and why? What should be in this thing, in this thing we call the Bible? Who was orthodox and who was a heretic, and like in Marcion's case, was simply an argument you solved among yourselves. My opinion was as good as yours, and your opinion was as good as mine. But we discussed it and argued over it and so forth. That's being proto-orthodox then, if you happen to be the one that eventually wins. As a matter of fact, the canon of Scripture was not even discussed at the Nicene Council. Athanasius was a bishop in 367 AD, wrote a Easter letter and sent it out. And that Easter letter was the first thing that we have that has survived. It's the oldest thing that we have that survived ancient documents that has a list with the 27 books of the New Testament just as we have it today. But only in one region around Alexandria. He was a bishop of Alexandria. The problem is he did not create the New Testament canon. But varying lists continue. There were more lists in the 3rd century, in the 4th century, in the 5th century, even on into the 6th century. people of the early church, in the early centuries, early Christian church, they considered a lot of writing inspired. I call it a kind of a Christian progressive dinner. You know what a progressive dinner is. You go to the next place and you have soup and salad, and then you go to the next place and you have the main course and dessert and so forth. Well, the progressive dinner for back then might have been that when you went to one house, somebody was reading the Gospel of Thomas out loud, and it didn't make the canon. Somebody else was reading the Gospel of Judas out loud, and it didn't make the canon. Somebody else might have been reading the Apocalypse of Peter out loud. Somebody else might have been reading the book we now call Matthew. In the first few centuries of the creation of Christianity, there was a lot of people doing a lot of different things with a lot of different texts, and they considered all of it inspired. Not like Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. And you know when it was invented. And codices, it's a Latin, and it just means a book. This is a codex, if you will. A codex, C-O-D-E-X. And no, it's not the product you're thinking about. But it's a codex, and it's codices. They were books called books. There's no date for the invention of it. They don't know when it came about. But think about it. What they had was scrolls. And the scrolls are long. And the scrolls, like the Isaiah scrolls, are in many pieces, obviously, because Isaiah is long. And there's many different scrolls for many different books. And when Scripture refers to books in Hebrew or in Koine Greek, it's referring to scrolls for the most part. And these scrolls, think about it. If I wanted to read, let's say Matthew, the book of Matthew. Let's say that the book of Matthew was a scroll. And I wanted to read something right out of them. It's a very long gospel. Now, and I wanted to read something right out of the middle of the book of Matthew. What am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to unroll and unroll and unroll and unroll and unroll and unroll until I find that spot, right? And then I have to roll it all back up. And so that's a problem. The other problem is a scroll is not as portable. A whole basket or a whole box of scrolls is pretty hard to run around with. These codices came up sometime in the development of Christianity, and some people even think that it might have been Christians who came up with the original idea of codices, because basically what you're saying is we're going to take this scroll and we're going to cut it up in little pieces. Then we're going to sew it together and put a cover on each side. And then when I want to read something in the middle of Matthew, I'm going to just go to the middle of Matthew. There were many, and there are today, this is physical evidence that we have that exist. And that physical evidence includes codices which exclude many books that we include in our current Bible, and include many books that we don't have in our current Bible. One of the things that was very important to them was the oldest. And so obviously first century writings were more important than other writings as they looked at them. Because Matthew was an apostle after all. All right? And Luke was a friend of Paul who ran around with Paul, so that makes Luke important. And Mark was a companion of Peter, and he wrote the Gospel of Peter, and that makes that important. And of course John was an apostle, and that makes that important. And so the names themselves might very well have cropped up out of trying to convince other people to use particular books. And so what emerged was that which was most palatable, what could be, I hate to use the word sold, but sold to the people in the most efficient way. The canon of the Bible was finally settled. The only answer that I could give you, or the only answer I think anyone should give you, is not yet. Not yet. Worldwide, there are still many Bibles. The Protestant Bible, yes, is generally largely accepted by Protestants around the world. Well, except in the East and the Middle East, where they have taken out the Revelation of John, the book of Revelation in the back. The Roman Catholic Bible has in it the Apocrypha. Most people don't realize that in the early centuries, early Christians read a Greek Old Testament, not a Hebrew Old Testament. Only in the rabbinic tradition later on did the Hebrew Bible get, you might want to call it redeveloped. The Roman Catholics had this Apocrypha. Apocrypha was the Greek writings, and so we still have many different lists around the world. And so when I ask the question, the Bible, inspiration or perspiration, I just think about the fact that people were thrown out of the church. There were wars, people killed, people tortured, families split up, whole classes of people condemned. And it sounds more like centuries of perspiration to me, not a brief time of inspiration. There is so much physical evidence that reveals what more likely happened in the development of Christianity today than we've ever had before. And so I wonder, as time moves on, in a world where we have 5,700 manuscripts with hundreds of thousands of variances between them, some minor, yes, most minor as a matter of fact, but some very significant variances between them, when we know early manuscripts did not even contain certain things. Back at the end of the 1800s, right before the 20th century started, there were only a few hundred manuscripts to deal with. Today there are over 5,500 manuscripts. And so I just wonder what's going to happen now that the general public is hearing in plain English, in lay language, what seminarians and people who work in research universities with religious studies departments have known now for decades and decades and decades. Since so much has been discovered in the last century, it is time for what would happen if Christian pastors got up in the pulpits on Sunday morning and were just simply honest about how the Bible was developed. Is it beneficial for us to keep making a case in the face of all this evidence? We don't have a magic book. We have a good book. We have a book that is full of things to learn and to read that will help us in life. We have a book that tells us a lot about times gone by and some people who were so barbaric they would go and slaughter whole nations. And they would do it in the name of God, as if God told them to do it. We have a book that tells us that slavery is right and that slaves should obey their masters, and so forth. We have a book that says women are second class. We have a book that condemns gay people from the get-go. We have a book that does a lot of things that are very negative, but we also have a book that teaches the golden rule. And we have a book that teaches us to be gentle, teaches us to be humble, teaches us to be poor in spirit and not proud of what we think we know about God. And we have a book that teaches us to want peace between every two persons. We have a book that's really important. And so my question is, at what point do we become people who can accept all of this data and realize that we may have it wrong? We may have it wrong about what early Christianity was like, and we may have it wrong about how Christianity came together, how the Bible itself was put together, and whether it was inspired or whether it was the result of perspiration, not inspiration. Bring ourselves to actually be in the world, with the rest of the world, and realize that our real obligation is toward the other human beings that live in community with us. And it's not a matter of, do you know where you're going to go when you die? So at any rate, that's my soapbox, or my hay bale, Jan, for the evening. And so I apologize for those that were on Hangouts and didn't really get to talk or participate much. But we will try it again next week. So y'all have a great week. Bye-bye.